We were all born into some type of a situation, weren't we? What was the situation that you were born in? What was life like when you were born? Maybe there's some, maybe only a couple, that were born in the 40s. I don't know, maybe not. In the 40s, our world, our country was shaped by what? World War II, right? Maybe you were born in the 50s. I think it was picket fences, beaver cleaver, the soda fountain was kind of what you were born into, that kind of atmosphere. I was born in the 60s. If you were born with me in the 60s, what shaped us at that point in time? Vietnam and the Beatles. Sure. If you were born in the 70s, what was going on when you came to life? Gas lines. Does anybody remember waiting 3 blocks long to get your car filled up? Remember inflation? Remember mortgages? You thought you were getting a good deal if you were at 16%? That was the 70s. Now, I know there were some in this room born in the 80s. Those were boom times, weren't they? Everybody was making a lot of money. Disco was king. And as Spradlin likes to say, members-only jackets were all the rage. Hope you had one. I think maybe even some in this room were born in the 90s. Remember what was going on in the 90s? That wasn't that far ago. What was going on in the 90s, right? Al Gore invented the internet so we could all send information around the world and waste hours and hours of time surfing the internet. Somebody started Starbucks and got us all paying $3 or $4 for a cup of coffee. That was going on in the 90s. And maybe a few were even born in the 2000 to 2011 era. What was going on then? Apple, right? The iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, the everything. Information became available at the blink of an eye. That's what was going on when most of us were born. And so we're going to start off looking at the life of Moses as to what kind of situation was he born into. A little biblical history, right? God had promised his people this promised land, but he had this weird caveat. He said 400 years later you'll get this promised land. Until then, you're going to go to Egypt. And the way that they got to Egypt was really strange, right? Joseph, the guy with the Technicolor dream coat, his brothers sold him into slavery. He ends up in Egypt. He ends up saving his family from famine, bringing them all into Egypt. And there's like 70 of them. These are God's people. These are the Hebrews. These are the Israelites. There's only like 70 of them in Egypt. For almost 400 years, they're enslaved there by the Egyptians. And then there's about 1 million to 2 million of them. And then Moses is born. 1526 BC is the estimated time of Moses' birth. He is born. Egypt is almost done with their 400 years. They have no idea that there's a 400-year deadline to their mastery over God's people. But it's almost up. And so all of the action that we're looking at happening in Moses' life is in the book of Exodus, second book of the Bible. But we're actually going to be looking at the part of it that's portrayed or given to us by Stephen in Acts. If you read Acts over the last month, you know Acts 7, Stephen delivers this speech where he goes through the history of God's people, and the people loved his speech so much, what did they do to him? They killed him. Yeah. So pretty powerful speech, but we're going to use mostly the text from Acts 7 and Stephen's Cliff Notes version of what's going on in the book of Exodus. Okay? So here's the first thing. If you're following along in your notes, I've got some major blanks, really 4 areas that we're looking at in Moses' life. The first one is this. Moses is born under extenuating circumstances. Right? Acts 7, verse 17, we pick up the story. As the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, that's what I just talked about, that 400 years, the number of our people in Egypt greatly increased. Then another king who knew nothing about Joseph became ruler of Egypt. He dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so that they would die. Yikes. Exodus 1, verse 22 gives a little more detail to this. Then Pharaoh, the king of the Egyptians, gave this order to all his people. every boy that is born," these are Israelites, not Egyptian boys, "you must throw into the Nile," the river, "but let every girl live." Insert your girls' rule jokes here. Imagine this. Women are giving birth to babies and having to throw them into a river to drown. This is the circumstances. These are the extenuating circumstances that Moses is born into, and it shapes his life. It doesn't completely define his life, but it shapes his life. Maybe you've seen this going around on the internet lately. The great Steve Jobs died a week or two ago, was it, right? No doubt a man who did many cool things and helped invent many cool things. Maybe you know a little bit about his story. There he is. You've seen this quote: "Born out of wedlock, given up for adoption, dropped out of college." And then I hate this little question at the end, don't you? What's your excuse? What's my excuse? Why am I not changing the world like that? Doesn't matter, right? The circumstances that we're born in. God can use us. God can do great things. Well, if you know the story, and as we continue along, we know that just didn't completely define him. But what happened next was Moses had an extraordinary rescue. Extraordinary rescue. Verse 20, "At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for in his father's house. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him in and brought him up as her own." You remember this? Basically what happens is Moses' parents get this great idea. They're supposed to throw their baby in the Nile, and so what they do is they construct a little basket, right? And they waterproof the basket, and they put it in the reeds of the Nile. They keep it out of the current, and they put it in a place where Pharaoh's daughter is known to go and bathe. And then Moses' older sister Miriam watches as the action happens. She's watching the baby. She's watching Pharaoh's daughter come down to take a bath. Pharaoh's daughter sees the baby, hears it crying, picks it up, feels sorry for it, wants to do something about it. And here comes Miriam, Moses' sister. "Hey, how about I get a Hebrew woman to nurse that baby for you?" Right? And who does she get? Her mom, Moses' mom, gets hired, gets paid to nurse and to take care of her own baby. Brilliant, isn't it? An extraordinary rescue takes place. God sets all of this up. An extraordinary rescue. Wisdom, smarts, cunning, whatever it is with Moses' family. Keep this particular child from dying in the river. So Moses grows up in Pharaoh's household. The Egyptians, right? They are enslaving. They're enslaving God's people. They are like the pinnacle of humanity at that time. They had the best engineers, the best economists. They had the best society going. And now Moses gets to grow up in the Pharaoh's house, under all of that privilege, under all of that education, with all of that wealth even. Verse 22 says this: "Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and in action." Understand this. Moses is in the perfect spot to rescue his people, is he not? I mean, you couldn't write this and have anybody believe it, right? The truth is stranger than fiction. Moses is basically adopted into Pharaoh's family. He's now the inside man of the enemy, basically. His family is still around. His mom is nursing him. Moses' dad is a Levi priest, so he's still learning about God from his parents. He's learning all about God that way, and he's learning about all the ways of the world from the Egyptians. It said he was handsome, he was educated, he was powerful. This is Moses. He was rescued from what? He was rescued from death in the Nile, and he was rescued from a life of slavery. Understand for just a moment the theological connections there. How any of us who place our trust in Jesus Christ are saved from death we're also saved from a life of slavery. A couple of questions to ponder. What have you been rescued from? Addictions, abuse, divorce, greed, sin of all kinds. What have you been rescued from? If you think about that question, I think hard enough and prayerfully enough, I think then you'll be able to answer the next question that I'm asking that's also in your notes, is what might you be rescued for? In our own midst, like Buck and Tara, are the perfect examples of this, are they not? Rescued from a life of alcohol and drugs and excessive skateboarding, right? To go into a life of helping others with drugs and alcohol.
Excessive skateboarding.
Yes, excessive skateboarding. Candace, thank you. No, it's good. I like it. So that's, think about that for ourselves, right? What are we in a perfect position to be a rescuer of? So Moses is in this perfect position, right? I mean, you couldn't have scripted this any better. And what happens next is what happens to a lot of us, even though we're in the right position, even though miraculous things have happened for us. We blow it, don't we? Has anybody blown it? I've blown it like 5 times just in the last 7 days. Okay? Blown it. Done dumb things. Acted spur of the moment. Whatever it is. And Moses did the same. Moses had an epic failure. An epic failure. The good news about reading characters like him in the Bible is making my failures look a lot smaller. I'm thankful to Moses for this, for sure. Moses had an epic failure. Verse 23. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian. So he went to his defense, and he avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Now, Moses was 40. Maybe it was that 40-year-old midlife crisis. Anybody ever done that? You know, tried to fit in with the homies a little bit, even though you're too old or whatever to fit in with the homies. I wonder how much of that was affecting him and his actions at that point. He was going down just to be with his people, just trying to fit in, and he kills a guy. Saw this quote, I think it's from a movie. It says, "Stop trying to fit in when you were born to stand out." Moses shouldn't have been fitting in. He was born to stand out. His circumstances put him in an awesome position. But he had to learn a lesson, kind of the hard way. Verse 25, Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue him. I love this next part. But they did not. They did not see that. The next day, Moses came upon 2 Israelites who were fighting. Brothers, they're fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" Ooh, the news is out on Moses. Everybody knows about his epic failure. It's going through all the circles, all the gossip mill, the rumor mill is going. I mean, imagine this. Moses was so powerful. He killed a man with his bare hands and then buried him in the earth, in the sand. He was strong, no doubt. Later on, the prophet Zechariah would say this, Zechariah 4, verse 6. "Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord Almighty." How many people have got in trouble using their own power, using their own force, and not just waiting for God's Spirit to move and to act? I think we oftentimes get ourselves in difficult positions because we're in a hurry. We act out. We're not as in control of our emotions and our outbursts as we would like to be. So Moses kills this guy with his bare hands. He catches some grief from his fellow Israelites. Verse 29 says, when Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. Put yourself in the position of Moses right now. Your sin has just been found out. Pharaoh's now after him. His own household is now after him. His own people don't like him, don't want anything to do with them. And he's on the run. He leaves the palace and he goes to the desert. How many people have been in a desert caused by their own sin, caused by their own poor choices, caused by bad actions? I'm the only one. Okay. The desert. I think in that desert, Moses had quite an identity crisis. Imagine this. Moses' name in Egyptian means found in a river. Would you have an identity crisis if your name was found in a river? He has 2 sons. One of his sons' name is Gershom, which means alien. So here we have found in a river, an alien hanging out in the desert far away from civilization. An alien, a stranger in the desert. Have you ever found yourself there? In the desert? Maybe it's a self-induced desert of punishment. What we'll find out with Moses, and I think the hope that we have, is it can be a God-ordained place of preparation. And that's what's going to happen with Moses. His epic failure doesn't define him. He's out in the desert. He's questioning his own identity and purpose and what is his life all about. He had so much, and yet he fell so far. But the reality is, going into the desert as a place of preparation is standard operating procedure for God's people and God's leaders in the Bible. Did you know that? Joseph spent time in the desert. Moses spent time in the desert. Elijah spent time in the desert. John the Baptist spent time in the desert. Paul, the apostle, spent time in the desert. And God's own son, Jesus, spent time in the desert. Not just as punishment, but as preparation so that God could use them, so he could burn out all the junk. I like to think what it would be like to go through that desert school of character development. The desert school of character development. The tuition is high. The travel is long. The climate is dry. There's no air conditioning. And there's no internet, of course. What kind of classes did Moses take in this desert character development school? I think the first class he took was what we'll call Obscurity 101. Have you ever taken that class, Obscurity 101? Exodus 3, chapter 3, verse 1 says that not only was Moses in the desert, he was in the far side of the desert. He didn't just, leave Egypt and go to the outskirts or go to the suburbs. He was on the far side of the desert. He was exercising. He was showing us all what downward mobility looks like. How many people like downward mobility? It's very countercultural, isn't it? Downward mobility. He went from the palace to the plains, right? He went from eating scrumptious desserts to scarcely finding food in the desert. He went from dining with heads of state to counting heads of sheep. He went from being on the who's who list to asking himself the question, who am I? Found in a river, my son alien. Obscurity 101. Not many people sign up for that class, at least not willingly, right? I think later on, maybe in his junior year, he took time management 301. A long time he had to manage, right? 40 years. It's not that he had a lot of tasks to manage. He just had a lot of time to manage. He would need this class. He would need to build up his own understanding of time management for what he was about to do later on. probably like me, you've been in a car with kids before, right? Have you been in a car on a trip with kids? Do you know the question I'm about to ask? For our family, we're going to go to Denver. We get the kids in the car. We're going down 40. We haven't even started to go uphill yet. And what's the question? Everybody say it with me. Are we there yet? Moses was going to have to hear this a lot in his life. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And so he needed to learn how to manage this kind of time. It said, and I love this, it said that the children of Israel only needed one night to get out of Egypt. But they would need 40 years to get the Egypt out of the children of Israel. It takes time. James, in James 1, verse 4, and I love the Message version because so many of us, right, if I'm imagining most of you are like, ew, I don't want this desert school of character development. I don't want any of these classes. Here's what James has to say. So don't try to get out of anything prematurely. Let it do its work so you become mature and well-developed, not deficient in any way. Time management, 301. I think another class that Moses took was Solitude 401. Solitude 401. Every leader must take this class. They must learn the art of solitude. Last week, Chris Braddon in his Bold Leadership series said sometimes leaders have to stand alone, right? Sometimes leaders have to stand alone between their people and the people that they're against or whatever it is. Sometimes leaders just have to stand alone. How can we stand alone if we don't know how to get alone with God? How can you hear the voice of God unless you get away and listen and strain out all the other voices that are coming at you each and every day and every moment? Get alone to hear God only. Psalm 46:10. Many of you know it. Be still and know that I am God. If you're like me, you have oftentimes a lot of struggle getting still, hearing God's voice, and just being alone with Him. So Obscurity 101, Time Management 301, Solitude 401 are all these classes that Moses has been enrolled in. How are you feeling about that? You guys ready to sign up? No? I don't see anybody raising their hand yet. We don't want to wait on anything, do we? We want whatever kind of character development that we go through to be downloaded off the internet in about 30 seconds or less. I've got a Kindle. I can download a 300-page book in about 30 seconds. And that seems too long. Doesn't it? We want everything that we need to go through to come to us quickly and easily. A couple months ago, we were having family dinner time, and I don't know what my kids were up to. They were asking the question of Katie and I, like, what was life back like in the olden days? I didn't think I was that old. Now my kids are calling my childhood or whatever olden days. They know about that. We've told them stories about the telephone in the kitchen with that long, tangled-up cord. Do you guys remember? Like that was the only phone in the house. And so somehow, the idea of a camera and film came up. Right? Does anybody remember film? Like just stuff you had to put in the camera and get it all right, take your pictures, hope that it wound back into the little thing, and then you took it to the photomat or Walmart or whatever. It used to be you had to wait like a week, and anymore you only got to wait a few hours, right? Remember what that was like? So I'm trying to explain my kids this concept of film. I mean, it's like right over their heads. They're like, well, why didn't you just turn the camera around and look at the screen? Because we didn't have that back in the day. Some things just take time to develop. Don't they? Some things just take time to develop. A couple of questions for you to think about. What has caused your trip into the desert? Maybe you've been there. Maybe you're there now. What has that been? A financial struggle, a relational struggle, a legal struggle, a sinful thing, a way that you just acted out, your own pride? What is it that's gotten you into that desert? And the follow-on question to that is, what do you hope to learn there? If you're in a desert, my encouragement is don't try to find your way out. Try to understand what God is doing in the desert. So Moses is there. He's in the desert, struggling with his identity, wondering who he is, what has he done with his life, how has he messed up? And then God comes in with an extreme encounter. Moses has an extreme encounter with God. Acts 30, 7 verse 30. After 40 years had passed, how long had he been in the desert? Yeah, 40 years. I don't like hearing this any more than you guys do. An angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. As he went over to look more closely, he heard the Lord's voice saying, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses trembled with fear and did not dare look. Then the Lord said to him, take off your sandals. The place where you are standing is holy ground. It's holy ground. Here's Moses. He sees this burning bush. It's burning, but it's not burning up. He sees flames, but nothing is really on fire. There's no ashes. There's no soot. It's also strange that the bush is talking to him, isn't it? This series is called Fuel because here we catch a glimpse of the fuel that's burning in this bush, but not burning up. It's inextinguishable. It's inexhaustible. Moses will need to remember that this is who God is. An inexhaustible, inextinguishable God who can do anything, who can do more, who transcends physical law. And I think we, as we study this story and we study his life, need to remember that that's our God too, who can burn a bush without burning it up. We need to know that we have that kind of power, that we have that kind of God as well. An inextinguishable, inexhaustible God. So imagine you were there. You were in this desert and you see this bush aflame but not burning up. And you hear God talking to you out of this bush. And he says, take off your shoes. This is holy ground. What would that be like for you? For years, as I've heard this story, I've thought that this would probably be the most intimidating moment of my life. A burning bush, flames coming out of it, being told to get rid of my shoes because I'm on holy ground. I know I'm not a holy person. I get what God is trying to say here. For years, I was intimidated by this story. As I've studied this, as I've learned a little bit more, hopefully, about the character of God, I see maybe it's different. You see, usually in the Bible, holy stuff is not to be touched, right? You are not to touch holy items. Even the Jews of the day, if they had the Torah, the scrolls, they were not able to touch them with their fingers. They had to wear gloves or they had to have a cloth to be able to hold on to God's law. There was always a distance. There was always something that kept us from touching holy things because we're unholy people. But I see this as something that's happening that's different right now. God isn't saying, Moses, be intimidated with me. That's why I want you to take off your shoes. I'm hearing God say, Moses, I want to be intimate with you. Take off your shoes. Come in. Feel the heat from the fire. Put your toes in the warm sand. And listen to me. And look at me. I'm restoring you. I'm showing you who I am. Because you're going to need this for what I have for you coming up. Instead of being intimating, I see it was an intimate time. Not intimidating, intimate. And I love that about God. After Moses was ready, in God's timing, did you notice how everything changed for Moses in an instant? One instant. He's out tending the sheep. There's the bush. Boom. It happens. Everything can change in a moment when you're in the desert. Did you know that? I don't know what kind of desert you're in right now, but I want to give you this encouragement that things can change for you in a moment. You probably won't know how they're going to happen. You're not anticipating a burning bush, but things can change in an instant for you. I, for a long time, was in the desert of singleness. I was a single guy for a long time. I didn't get married till I was 34. And I wasn't happy about that. Yeah, I know. I was very unhappy about being in the desert of singleness, to be honest with you. I started thinking about it probably about age 22 when I got out of college, and I didn't get married until I was 34. So I had 12 years in the desert of singleness. Let me tell you how pathetic it was for me in my desert of singleness. I remember driving down the street, being in a hurry. Oh no, red light. Darn it. Wait a minute. Maybe when I look over, God will have my wife in the lane next to me, right? Oh no. Oh no. Seriously. Like, does anybody relate? Was anybody this way? It was just me, right? The grocery store was an emotional experience for me. I'd be pushing my cart down the aisle. I know she's going to be in the produce section, right? Oh, nothing. Turn the cart, go down the Mexican food aisle. I know she'll be here, right? No, I would just cruise the aisles of the grocery store looking. God, please, where is she? Come on, get me out of this desert of singleness. In that 12-year period, I had a lot of injuries, I think, at that time. Blew out a shoulder, ankle, all this kind of stuff. Every time I would go to the ER, every time I would go to the doctor, I'd be convinced it was because my wife would be the nurse. My future wife would be the nurse who was attending me. Or maybe, hopefully, even the doctor who was attending me. Even better. How pathetic, right? Yeah, that's me. One day, in this room, it all changed. Took 12 years. For some, it may take longer. For some, maybe less. But in one instant, in one moment, I didn't see a burning bush, but I saw a pretty hot girl. Can I say that? My encouragement is whatever desert that you're in, don't try to run from it. Don't try to flee from it. See what God is doing. I know it's a scary thing to think about, going into the desert, but man, God does great work there, and it can change in a moment. Verse 34, God speaking to Moses out of this burning bush. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. He's saying, Moses, remember that thing you were going to do for me 40 years ago? Now it's time. You've learned. You understand who I am. Now it's time. I have heard their groaning, and I have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt. He's back on task 40 years later after his desert school of character development. Amazing life of Moses. I do believe eternity will be spent hanging around with people we read about in this book, going, man, how did you do that? What were you thinking when that was going on? How did you make it? How did you fail so bad? I don't know. My encouragement, whatever desert you're in, learn, be patient. God can change it in a moment. Let's pray. God, I pray right now that you will show us how we can be more like Moses. Like Jesus too, but like Moses, especially in the situation that we found him in today. I ask that you would prepare us like you prepared him. That you would show us how to rely on your power and your might and not just our own. God, I thank you for rescuing us. Show us what you would have us do, how we can rescue others. Let us learn from and let us learn during our failures and our time in the desert. And most of all, Father, I pray that we can see you as not a God who is intimidating towards us, but one who wants to know us and wants to be with us intimately. I pray in this church, among these lives right now, you will encourage those in the desert. You allow us to see Moses' life and understand that it's not completely out of reach for us. I pray you would do your will with this church, with these people. We love you, and we know what you're doing is rescuing the world. Show us how we fit in, Father, and thank you for doing that. In Jesus' name, amen.